Hi, I'm Ken Heyman. As Managing Director of the Advisor Institute at AllianceBernstein, I meet with financial advisors every day. One thing I hear expressed over and over is their frustration with how much they are juggling. The advisors I talk to are constantly trying to balance competing priorities, from managing client relationships to prospecting for new business, and of course, the tasks of leading their team. This problem of juggling is why we created the AllianceBernstein Digital Coach. This is a proprietary tool that draws on the wisdom of behavioral economics and unique perspectives from the Advisor Institute's practice management experts. In less than 10 minutes with the Digital Coach, you will be able to identify and prioritize the top needs of your practice. And armed with those insights, you will be well on your way to tackling the challenge of limited resources while positioning your business to seize opportunities for growth. Let the Digital Coach guide your journey to success. Visit abfunds.com/go/digital coach. That's abfunds.com/go/digital coach.
Hello and welcome to this version of Secrets of Successful Advisors with Ken Heyman. Today we are going to talk about something that I know advisors are interested in, which is how to reprice existing clients. But Ken, we can't start there. We need to review the catch-22 that can cause this problem, which is that catch-22 when we start to price brand new clients. Can you kind of review that for us as a way to begin?
Well, Scott, that's a great way to frame the conundrum. If we're going to spend some time today talking about repricing clients, once you've established a relationship, it really is rooted in the whole challenge of pricing itself. The vast majority of advisors who listen to this podcast have an enormous amount of discretion about the price they charge. They probably have a fee scale that they operate with that their firm provides them. That typically suggests a maximum fee in a range. They have some range below which they can't go, but inside that range is a huge amount of variance. And what we see across the industry, if you look at the research from various sources, Price Metrics would be the big aggregator of this research, is that pricing behavior is all over the map. They're advisors, it doesn't matter where, when, how old, how many years of service, how many assets, what location geographically, pricing's all over the map. So what's going on there? Well, what's going on there is that the human being who is the financial advisor in the moment of the process, I should say, of originating a new relationship has, as you described it, a catch-22, that famous sense of you're caught between a rock and a hard place. And the catch-22 is essentially this. It takes time for trust to build between the client and the advisor. That time that has to pass is characterized by experiences. The client has to have experiences of the advisor that build a sense of trust and confidence in them, in their goodwill, and in their professional competency to provide their needs. So time has to pass, experiences have to happen. It actually takes about 2 years, if you look across a large number of relationships, for the client to kind of go all the way into a satisfied sense of, you know what, this is working and I can have confidence in this person. They kind of finally cross that threshold and they're like, yes, everything's good. Unfortunately, to your point about the catch-22, the advisor has to set the price at the very earliest stage of the relationship. So in some cases, I know advisors who expect to close the relationship in the first hour. Now, our advice to advisors, for reasons that we can explain in another setting, is you should take more than one session to move through a process with the client. Why? So you can deliver these unique experiences that build up a higher level of trust before you set the price. But what happens is, if you're trying to set the price right away because you want to close the relationship right away because they're in the office and you were told for years, hurry up. If they're in the office, you got to close them. Well, then the context in which you're setting price means that there's not a sense of trust yet. There's not a sense of confidence. There's a high sense of risk that the individual doesn't have any experience of your value. And so the natural inclination for most people, and we see it across the industry, is that you shave a little off the fee so that the pain of making this choice in the absence of trust and value and a sense of confidence, that pain is reduced because the price is reduced. So the situation that the advisor finds himself in is, I need to take a bunch of time and build trust with this person for trust to be at its full flower, but I have to set the price at a very early stage, which means I feel almost compelled to discount the services to make it easy for this person to pick me. It's a really challenging situation. It activates a lot of insecurity and fear of loss in the advisor. It's built in at a very basic psychological level, very hard to overcome, but it is just part of the challenge of doing the work of the retail financial advisor.
Well, so if that's the dilemma, you would think, I mean, logic would tell you, math would tell you, well, okay, they come to love you in 2 to 3 years. That trust is well established. So it's no trick. We'll just go in 2 to 3 years and just price it correctly. And everybody listening to this, if they're in their car, is just clenching the wheel full of anxiety. And we know it's real. Why is this one of the most fearful things that an advisor confronts?
Well, and it's really appropriate for you to pick the word fearful at this point. And I know advisors don't like that kind of labeling on their behaviors. We'll call it anxiety, call it reluctance, whatever it is. But you and I both know from lots and lots of coaching sessions, when you're sitting down with advisors who are very frustrated, they have priced a relationship well below what the work and value that they're providing should reflect. And now they're in the relationship and they feel stuck with the price. And you see this a lot in advisory practices that acquire other advisors' practices. When the other advisor comes in, maybe he's been doing this for a long time, and the new advisor's like, oh my goodness, the pricing here is dreadful. Now, what's interesting is if you look anecdotally at those advisors who have very deep convictions about their value and very deep convictions about the price that they feel is appropriate for them to charge, that you see advisors who are inheriting or purchasing practices repricing the practice. And you see to great extent that there's very little regretted attrition that occurs when that happens. And so the experience is you can reprice, but the experience is most advisors have very deep anxieties about doing that. And the reason for that has to do with some of the insights we can take from Daniel Kahneman and all of the luminaries in the behavioral economics world in terms of the irrational nature of loss aversion. Now, most advisors are familiar with this term, and it's kind of woven itself now in the lexicon of retail advisory practice. Loss aversion describes this built-in dynamic in the human central nervous system that losses are experienced as about 2.5 to 3 times more emotionally impactful than the same level of gain. A way of thinking about it is, if I lose $100 playing blackjack at the casino, I'm going to have an emotional experience of loss. The same level of positive experience of gain would require me to win $250 to $300. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to the potential for loss. Now, loss aversion explains almost all behaviors of clients. When markets get volatile, clients experience a small loss. It registers as extremely painful. It causes them to be highly concerned about the future. They imagine even greater losses, and in some cases can go into a full-on panic when they imagine those greater losses. And so they call the advisor in this fit of anxiety and say, we need to do something. I can't afford this bad thing I'm imagining. Well, that's just built into the human central nervous system. Some people cope with it a little better than others, and some clients kind of get over it if they invest for a long time and they realize, things come and go. They can talk themselves out of the panic, but a lot of clients never do. What's interesting is that as advisors, because advisors work with risk all the time and can see the behavior of the client, they can become immune to the fact that they also will react from a perspective of loss aversion. So what happens is this: you're working with a client, the client's underpriced, perhaps the client's life has evolved, so you're adding new levels of service, or perhaps the engagement as you began it, the client has requested more, required more. You're charging a fee. That fee is an agreement between you and the client. It's something the client has come to trust and accept that this is how it works between us. As you pointed out, that love has grown. There's a tremendous amount of confidence. That level of confidence doesn't immediately translate into, oh, I think I want to pay you more, right?
Yeah.
So the advisor comes to this relationship and is like, I am not getting paid enough for what I'm doing. But the advisor knows that if they say to the client, hey, I need to raise my price because you're not paying me enough, that they're violating the fundamental bond of trust, that the bond of trust is built on the client's experience, that they matter to the advisor as a person, that the advisor has their best interest at heart and first and foremost, that the advisor is motivated out of some degree of caring toward them to provide these services. It's not this dispassionate engagement, and that they're getting a good deal, meaning a good value for what they're paying. And so that fee becomes pretty solidified inside the existing relationship. So the advisor is sensitive as they approach the conversation that if I raise the idea of a fee and I say, look, I need to raise my fees so that I can make more money and run a more lucrative practice, that the basic intuitive premise of I need to raise my fees because I'm not making enough money for the work that I'm doing here will violate the bond of trust, at least strain the relationship. And the advisor's loss aversion kicks in and they're like, they put on the brakes and they're like, I can't stand that feeling of potential loss. And, there's some wisdom there. Scott, as you and I both know, the cost and time, effort, and resources to gain a new client is many times higher than the cost of time, effort, and resources to keep an existing client. Retention is the foundation of growth. So we now have a new catch-22 that's built into the work, right? And it's all psychological. That on the one hand, we know if you can raise your fees, even a modest level, the structure of the business is supported, and we have evidence that advisors do this all the time. It's quite common for advisors to reprice businesses that they buy from other advisors and to do so successfully with very little regretted attrition. We can observe it all over the industry. And yet, in the moment of the conversation with the client, if the advisor feels that they have to describe it as, I need to raise my fees because I need to have a more lucrative business, the advisor knows in their gut that this is going to strain and potentially cost them a relationship. To your point, it's a catch-22.
It strikes me, Ken, that is part of how this is often presented to advisors, right? It's often presented to advisors as you got to make your practice more lucrative. And if that's in the back of your head, when you're talking to a client, it's got to feel like that relationship is at risk, not because you think it's at risk, because it actually is at risk. So if it's not about your practice, what is it about if you know that this is a mispriced relationship? How can it be presented to the client in a way that does not violate that foundation of trust?
Well, the great thing about our understanding of the psychology of client relationships, and I think one of the hallmarks of what the Advisor Institute is offering to advisors, is the ability to look at these relationships through the lens of this psychological insights about how humans function. And so to reprice a business means that we shift from the moment of conversation and say, I need to reprice the business for my purposes and potentially violate that trust where I'm putting my interest ahead of your own now if I'm repricing. And we need to look at how do we preserve all those great connections, trust, regard, value, the sense of confidence that the client has in the advisor. How do we preserve them, maybe even augment or expand them in such a way that a new price can be introduced and that new price makes complete emotional sense to the client. And I know advisors are listening to this and saying, okay, I'll bite. How do you do that? How do I come to a client, propose a new price, and have the client say, oh my goodness, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I'd be crazy to work with anyone else besides you based on what you're offering me. And that shift is the key to breaking out of the catch-22. The shift is, what are you offering them? So my observation to you, if you come to the client having provided a set of services the client has come to understand and value, it fits their current situation in life. You've run it the same way for 3, 5, 7, 10 years. We're all in a nice flow. Everything's working along. We know what to expect, kind of as you've pointed out a couple of times to me over the years, that Groundhog Day experience of the annual review. It's the same conversation every year, which is pretty cool. And if the client's getting what they need, you're providing what they need. That context isn't going to allow you to raise the price. Hey, we've been doing it the same way for this many years. I want to increase my price by 10 or 15 basis points. That's going to come as a shock. However, there's something that's going on in human beings that advisors, once they understand it, liberates them from those constraints. And what's going on is normal adult development. Let me explain what I mean by that, because it makes perfect sense to advisors who have had children or are parenting children, and it makes perfect sense when they start to think about their own life, but sometimes it's hard for them to map that over and realize this thing's happening with clients. And that is that human beings live through stages. They're most obvious when you have little kids because the stages are shorter and the process of evolution is more intense. One day the kid's in daycare, the next day they're going to kindergarten, and after that they're going to elementary school, then after that junior high, then senior high, then college, then out to work, stage, and each stage they're advancing, their needs are expanding, parenting gets more complicated. Like, look, when the kid is crawling around on the floor, I have a new grandson who just started walking a few months ago. Well, the parenting challenge from crawling to walking is a pretty big step. Go forward a few years, the parenting challenge from riding a bicycle to driving a car, even bigger step, right? Humans change and evolve. Now, the advisor can become aware of this and something magical can happen. You engage a client at some point in early midlife, typically. They wake up one morning and say, wow, I've got wealth accumulating, or I inherited something, or something occurred, or I had this happen recently. An acquaintance of mine was in a private plane and there was some experiences in the plane that were very terrifying. Everybody lived, no injuries whatsoever, but it redefined his sense of the future and planning and galvanized his need. And so obviously he took a whole set of actions to do that. So you get these folks, you get them organized, you deliver the services. It's 2, 3, 4 years. They're in all the way with you. Trust is at a high level, and that conversation is the same. Now, if you're observant, this human being is continuing to accumulate wealth. You're helping them accumulate wealth. They're starting to make decisions in other areas of their financial life. The wealth accumulates larger. They get more and more complexity. That complexity affects them. Well, while that's happening, guess what? Their family is aging. Kids are getting older. Things are happening in their marriage. Things are happening in their friends. Things are happening in their business or their career. Complexity is getting greater. They're evolving. And so when we think about it, you look at clients in their 40s who come to see you, they need a pretty fundamental or basic engagement around investing, maybe some early stage planning. But 10 years later, they're in their 50s. Now we're starting to realize, hey, we've got to get ready for retirement. The kids are in college. We have to kind of button down some of the other decision making, or they sell a business and transform their dynamic, or they get that big promotion and now bonuses are flowing in, stock options are there, concentrated. I can go on. Everyone's following this. But then there is also the evolutionary need as they get into their 50s, early 60s, where if they become successful, there's legacy planning. What's this family story going to be? How are the kids going to talk about us with the grandchildren? And how will the grandchildren remember what we accomplished, where this wealth came from? And what does this wealth mean? So you see in each of these steps, complexity gets bigger and the role of the advisor appropriately expands. So our advice to advisors is to think about, in a kind of a general way, how should your practice evolve as clients go through these later stages of life? They go into midlife, pre-retirement, ramping up to retirement. They start needing to do advanced estate and legacy planning. What's the story of the family? They start having to think about multi-generational issues. Well, there are logical evolutionary steps for the advisor's practice. And we really see this as giving the advisor a chance to think proactively and be able to say, hey, we've worked with people like you before. We know that when clients transition from midlife into active preparation for retirement, a whole bunch of new things need to be addressed. We know that as clients achieve these very high levels of success and they begin to think about, all right, what do we want our legacy to be philanthropically and across the family? A whole new level of engagement is needed. The advisor's role has to expand. And what the advisor can do is say, look, we've worked with a lot of people like you. We know how to help. We have designed our business model so that as you are arriving at this place, we can meet you at this new level of need. Here are the services we're going to do. Here's the process of legacy planning, or the process of estate planning, or process of cash flow planning for retirement, process of gifting capacity analysis for philanthropy, all these important and evolutionarily advanced services they have to provide this client who's now at a much higher level of complexity. And by the way, as we do this for clients at this stage of life, the fee is different than it was earlier. And now you can attach the new fee, not to the old services, but to essentially a new engagement with the client. And we actually have some mapping in our presentations where we can show you these logical transitions that shift over time and where some of the markers are. What are some of the indicators that the client may be prepared for that? What we found when individuals have engaged this way, have even made very simple explanations of, hey, we need to do some new things in your life because you're at a different stage of life, your wealth is a little more advanced, and that's going to cost an additional 15 basis points a year, that clients, when they understand the value, and that's really, as from your perspective in consulting, and I know in terms of mine as well, when clients understand the value, they label the value differently. Now the fee becomes irrelevant. They're actually enamored of the new stuff they need and what the advice is going to do for them, and the fee's irrelevant.
It really strikes me, Ken, that you've hit on something. And though this is really interesting for our industry, we do this in other industries. The one that comes to mind, you reference the medical industry all the time when we talk about standard of care. If I were going to use an analogy there, the client often, or the patient, comes to you thinking they just need a nurse practitioner because they don't appreciate what's coming. And when we need a nurse practitioner, it's a matter of convenience and price. Who can I get to see quickly that is a bargain, or it's just convenience? But at some stage of life, we might need a specialist like an oncologist. And we think about that relationship utterly differently. I mean, the oncologist needs to be reasonable in their price, but there is no such thing as discount oncology. We don't even think about that. Convenience isn't as important. We need the problem solved. And so I think what you're saying, it lets the trust work for you, is these are the things we've done for you, but you're in a new stage now. And they appreciate the new stage. And the new stage comes with new solutions, and the new solutions come with a new price. Clients are going to really understand that.
You're right on the point here that the advisor needs to be aware of. And I think one piece that we could easily miss if we don't speak to it is the idea that the client may not recognize that they're moving into a new stage of life, and they may value the advisor delivering that information to them proactively. And let me kind of go into that just a little bit more, because the power of this for advisors, I think, is not well understood. But when advisors get it, it really increases their ability to serve their clients and meet them at their point of need. In childhood, for normal human development, the markers of stages are really clear. And if you go back to ancient cultures, you have things like the bar mitzvah or the confirmation. There's these major kind of stages of recognition. You were a child, now you're an adult. But in our culture, it's a little more evolutionary. There's elementary school, then junior high, then secondary school, then college, then graduate school, maybe, then off to work. There's also, you're dating, you're engaged, you're married with kids, right? And wedding ceremonies, what's the reason for a wedding ceremony? It's a marker of a transition from one stage and structure of life to a new stage. So I'll give you an example how the Advisor Institute thinks about this. We have a checklist for advisors to use called the premarital checklist, recognizing that when a young couple or a middle-aged couple who's getting married again is going through this evolutionary stage, they're transitioning from one stage to a new stage, there's an opportunity for the advisor to step in at that moment and say, well, you're about to enter into this new part of life or this new journey of life. We've thought about what this means, and we have some thoughts for you that may enrich, help, and support you doing this well. Now, what's the power of that? Well, there's two levels of power of that. One is the advisor is educating the client that they're in a new stage of life that the client was maybe beginning to understand or maybe hadn't even thought of. But now the advisor gives them categories and labels and allows the client to say, oh, you're right. And as I said earlier in the podcast, I have this new experience. I have a grandson. I wasn't expecting to have a grandson. It's not like it was something I was looking forward to my whole life. It came somewhat as a surprise a couple of years ago. And that's completely redefined my life. But guess what? Did I know how it was going to completely redefine my life? I'm kind of discovering it as I go. What if an advisor has been thoughtful in their experience with working with others, maybe draw from some of the research in the larger marketplace about how people normally develop? And some of these big markers of, like, when you sell a business, bam, everything changes. When you are promoted to that C-level suite, bam, everything changes. The complexity changes. When you get married, bam, everything changes. When you have kids, and I could go on. The idea here is for the advisor to think through what are the businesses they will be running and moving their clients from point to point through, and what are the complexities, what are the services. If they publish that standard of care, now they can sit down with the client and say, look, you went from your 40s into your 50s. I know you want to retire early in your 60s, so we have about 10 years left on a runway to get there. Clients in my practice that hit this milestone, we start working on a different set of issues. There's a whole bunch of new things we need to put in there and big important things that we need to have in place. Why? So nothing's missing that can hurt you. Nothing's missing that you should be taking advantage of. We've done this before. We know how to help. And this looks a particular way. And by the way, there's a price associated with that. So to your point, Scott, and I think it's a well-stated point, there's no such thing as discount oncology. Why? Because the value that we place on those services and the need that it addresses is so central and significant. And what we're simply suggesting here is it's an opportunity for the advisor to do the same thing and to step into the same level of value.
To sum it up, Ken, it's we know what's coming. We know what's coming. We know what to do about it. And this is the price to deal with it. And we're used to that in our society. We're just not used to that in financial services. I think you've really helped advisors understand this dilemma. And I hope everyone feels empowered to start to deal with it. Thank you all for your time and attention.